शुक्रिया प्रशांत भूषण साहब और सारे सुनने वाले। हम अपनी बातें अंग्रेज़ी में करेंगे जैसा कि ये है, लेकिन जैसा कि मिस भारद्वाज और प्रशांत भूषण जी ने आपको बताया, मेरी जो बातें हैं उसका मुख्तसर अनुवाद करके आप तक पहुंचाया जाएगा और हमको बहुत खुशी होगी अगर मेरी बातों से आपको मौजूदा हालात को समझने में कुछ मदद मिलेगी। अगर मेरी बातें आपके किसी काम आएंगी तो हमको इस बात की बड़ी खुशी होगी। अब हम अपना मजमून आपके सामने पेश करते हैं जो कि अंग्रेजी में है। In today's sessions, dear participants, I propose to begin with a performance audit of the UAPA before I share with you some broad thoughts on the Act. My audit is both from the perspective of the constitutional guarantee of liberty and from the perspective of national security, and attempts to see how the Act, as it plays out in real life, fares in securing the latter without impinging upon the former. One of the criticisms of the UAPA is that with its very low rate of conviction but high rates of pendency, it is the process that becomes the punishment. The National Crime Records Bureau's last report is for the year 2019, and for that year it shows conviction rates under crime head UAPA at the relatively high rate of 29.2%. How is this conviction rate arrived at? It's quite simple. In 2019, there were 2,361 UAPA cases pending trial. 113 were disposed of with the following breakup: conviction in 33 cases, acquittals in 64 cases, and discharge in 16 cases. Thus, as you can see, the rate of conviction at 29.2% is against the number of cases disposed of in a single year. 113 cases divided by 33. If examined against the total number of cases registered or total number of persons arrested, then the rate of conviction comes down to the more realistic figure of just around 2%, and the pendency rate for UAPA cases increases to almost 98%. These are court disposal rates which are quite well known. But perhaps not so well known is the police disposal rates that refer to completion of investigation. For UAPA cases, the Bureau's report shows charge sheeting rate at 42.5% and pendency rate at 77.8%. With such low rates of disposal and such high pendency, both at the investigation and the trial stages, it is no surprise that though the case might finally fail, the accused would come out of incarceration only after 8, 10, or in some cases even after 12 years. The case fails, the case ultimately has no legs to stand, but the accused has suffered. The accused has suffered jail for 8 years, 10 years, and 12 years. It is therefore not incorrect to say that in UAPA cases, the process itself is the punishment. At this point, it may be worthwhile to ask a question from a purely national security angle. Are these police disposal rates commensurate with dedicated legal framework that gives extraordinary powers to investigating agencies and suspends several fundamental and statutory rights of accused persons? Additionally, the NIA Act provides for a dedicated agency to respond to acts and conspiracies that have a bearing on national security. Surely these figures need more debate and accountability. On the face of it, however, it seems these special laws and dedicated agencies fail to carry out quick and focused investigations in UAPA cases. We must then ask whether the results justify the high toll on constitutional freedoms that this legal framework is based upon. One may recall here the Mumbai terror attack case. The attack had taken place when UAPA was yet to undergo the amendments of the year 2008, 2012, and 2009, making it more and more stringent. The attack was truly an international terrorist attack within the meaning of the UN resolutions that came to be later cited in the Amendment Act of 2008 as justification for making a stringent act still harsher. The attack had taken place from 26th to 29th November 2008 and the investigation, trial, appeals before the High Court, and finally before the Supreme Court were all over by 29th August 2012. The judgments of the courts show that the investigation and the trials were held in full compliance with the constitutional guarantees under Articles 20, 21, and 22 that are grafted on the different provisions of the CRPC. The terror attack, apart from the devastation in terms of killing of innocent people and massive destruction of properties, also led to, in an indirect and intangible way, some very harmful consequences for the country's criminal justice system. In a knee-jerk reaction, within a month of the attack, amendments were made in the UAPA that have far-reaching consequences. The amendments enlarged the meaning of Terrorist Act and added to the Act procedural sections 43A to 43F. Section 43D2 made it possible for the investigating agency to have the period of investigation extended till 180 days while the accused remained in detention. And Section 43D, 4 and 5 made it next to impossible for the accused to get bail. A few days ago, I came across a fine article by Ms. Farhan Naqvi describing how Act 35 of 2008 was passed in Parliament and how, ironically, its most stringent provisions were portrayed as some wonderful gift to the nation. With regard to the extended period for investigation, it was declared in the Parliament with pride, and I quote from Ms. Naqvi's article, "We have made a provision of 180 days under this law. Our laws are more tough than that of America and England. Can you give me the example of any other country where such laws exist?" There's an extract from a speech in the Parliament in support of extending the investigation period to 180 days. On the other hand, and around the same time, in the aftermath of the London terror attack of July 2007, when the British Parliament voted on a proposal to increase the time for pressing of charges from 14 days to 90 days, and only for terror-related offences, it was defeated by a resounding majority, and the proposed amendment was considered, and I quote, "a travesty to human liberty." They settled for a period of 28 days as temporary measure to be annually reviewed and reverted back to 14 days in 2012. This begs the question, how does one define a strong state? One with rhetorical statements about national security, polemical debates, and reduced accountability, or the other available modes which are accountable, conform to certain standards of civil liberties, and yet manage to perform perhaps better. The above example from our own Parliament suggests that we are willing to rob our people of their personal freedom far more than any other country, without anything to show for it and without any accountability. It is really quite distressing that what should have been a matter of acute embarrassment was being proclaimed with great pride. But that is the art of making dangerous laws. As to provisions regarding the grant of bail, we see today the courts struggling to overcome the barriers introduced in the Act for granting bail in cases that are seemingly unfounded and false. To my mind, Section 43D4 and 5 appear to compromise the fundamental principle of the criminal law regarding the innocence of the accused. Further, if the restrictions contained in those provisions are sought to be applied to the powers of the High Court or the Supreme Court, as it seems being done, then I feel the constitutional validity of those provisions may become doubtful. Justice Anjana Prakash, one of the panelists today, has very effectively developed and elaborated the point in some of her presentations. Unfortunately, the matter did not end with the amendments of 2008, and the Act has undergone further amendments in 2012 and again in 2019. As a result of the amendments of 2019, now an individual person can also be labeled a terrorist without any prior hearing. UAPA is indeed not the only law that inverses the burden of proof at the stage of grant of bail. Several special laws like NDPS, POCSO, and PMLA, before its provisions were read down by the SC, also have similar provisions and are liable to misuse. However, these acts still require the existence of a prima facie and specific case against the accused. It is here that the UAPA stands out. Its nebulous and sweeping definitions require next to nothing to allege a prima facie case of unlawful or even terrorist activity, something perhaps as trivial as having in one's possession a copy of War and Peace may be cited as evidence of supporting terrorism. A useful insight into how UAPA is intended to operate is also provided by examining how violence is sought to be viewed and presented by the state. Is violence categorized as crime by an individual or as crime by specific groups? Do state reports address these structural causes of conflict and violence at all? The NCRB's report dealing with cases during the periods 2000, 2004 and 2001-2005 do not have any data on cases under POTA or UAPA, but the report has a chapter in which violent crimes are classified under different heads. Violent crimes affecting life, violent crimes affecting property, violent crimes affecting public safety, violent crimes affecting women. The offenses are then further classified, and one of the subheads is motives of murder, and this is both interesting and important. With regard to the cases for years 2001-2005, it reads as under. The prominent motives behind murders were personal vendetta or enmity and property dispute as in the past. The other significant causes were love intrigues, 7.4%, and terrorist/extremist atrocities, 3.1%. Maharashtra has reported 60.8% murders due to class conflict. Bihar has accounted for 42.5% of murders, no prizes for guessing, due to casteism. In this analysis of the crime of murder, there is a clear causal connection between the offense and the offender. And more importantly, there is clearly discernible a structure of class and or caste and an awareness of social and class conflicts arising within those structures. I found this to be a very important acknowledgement of social and political tensions and their causal link to large-scale violence. It is also pertinent to note that in the 2004 and 2005 reports, terrorist/extremist violence accounts for 3.3 and 3.1% respectively of the total violent crimes and is relegated to incidents in certain specified areas only, whereas caste-related violence accounts for almost 27 to 33% of the crimes in certain states. Class and communal conflicts similarly account for a large percentage of the total violence. After 2004-2005, this sharp classification of offenses starts getting blurred. After 2004-2005, this sharp classification of offenses starts getting blurred until after 2014, the format itself is changed. It would seem from reading the more recent reports that terrorist violence, which earlier accounted for a very small percentage of total violent crimes, is brought center stage, while certain other structural conflicts are made completely invisible. It is a comment also on the political construction of violence, even in law. Offenses are now classified according to laws under which they are booked. Thus, murders that arise from caste or class or communal conflicts and which were earlier thus classified no longer disclose their genesis, but are shown as individual offenses listed under Section 302 IPC. Terrorist offenses are reclassified as offenses booked under the UAPA. and put in the chapter on offences against the state, together with IPC offences like sedition, like imputation, assertions prejudicial to national integration, Prevention of Damage to Public Property Act, etc. By such simple rearranging of violence, certain kinds of cases are made completely neutral, while certain other kinds of cases are made more politicized. An offense is rendered neutral because it's only reflected as offenses against the state or offenses under certain provision of the law without any further labels. Thus, lynching becomes simply a 302 offense. However, with regard to another set of offenses, the political grouping of the classification of acts suggests that there is a continuum from mere speech act that impute assertions prejudicial to national integration, to sedition, to damage to public property, to terrorism. It is the same sliding scale of anti-national activities. Let me try to make myself a little more clear by giving an illustration. Someone makes a perfectly peaceful speech in good conscience, based on reason and logic and citing constitutional and legal provisions to criticize some law or some actions of the government. Sorry. Some people then take out a peaceful protest march. Some others take out a march that's not so peaceful. Some public properties are damaged. As it might happen, some unlawful or terrorist organization or person also issues a statement in support of the cause. Someone else throws a bomb, killing a few people. Now, by virtue of the overbroad definition of UAPA, and by this method of grouping of offenses, all the incidents from the throwing of bomb to the making of the speech may all be treated as part of a single conspiracy or related offenses on a sliding scale of anti-national activity, and the speaker may find himself accused of a terrorist act. In other words, the grouping of violent terrorist acts, which earlier accounted for a mere 3.3% of total violent crimes, with non-violent speech acts or petty violence, creates a new imagination of terrorism and of national security, which includes all manner of dissent and which brings the problem of terrorism center stage. To my mind, this regrouping also has an adverse effect on national security, in that by focusing more on internal dissent, the cases posing a real threat to national security and which are no more than 3% fail to get the attention they warrant. Where has this most draconian law in the world's largest democracy taken us? The results are there. The results are all there for everyone to see. It stares us in the face in the death of Stan Swamy without a trial. And we must not also forget scores of Indians who get acquitted and come out of jail after 8, 10, or even 12 years with a broken life and practically no future. I submit UAPA has failed us on both counts, national security and constitutional freedoms. Before concluding, I would like to say that recently I came across a very good article by Mr. C.U. Singh, senior advocate, in which he argued in favor of raising claim for compensation for the accused getting acquitted after years of incarceration. I think it's an idea that's worth following up. Thank you all. Thank you very much for a very patient hearing.